Welcome to the Green Dialogue, and we have another special speaker who most of you know pretty well. Sam's going to talk about his new book and probably some other related topics, and then we'll open it up for dialogue and Q&A. And um, does anyone have any burning announcements they want to share before we hand it over to Sam? Okay, Sam, you are good to go. Thank you for being here. I guess you're guinea pigs for your first book review, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I did a real brief one last week to a small group in Detroit that I'd been working with for years. But yeah, it was just a few people, and it went really well. Everybody was well received. Of course, the emphasis of the book is, or at least most of the stories take place around our area right here in Haslett, around Mud Lake. But there were so many of the ideas in the book that are important to pretty much everybody. So they were pretty charged up about it. I was really glad to do that. But looking forward to today too. Glad to see a good bunch of you here, and thanks for coming in with your interest. And Leroy, thanks for giving me time to do this. I'm going to do the hardest part right now, and that's share the screen. If I can figure this out. Are we there? Maybe?
Yep, looks good.
Yes. Okay.
If you
Put it into show mode. Make things a little bigger. There we go. So, yeah, Mud Lake has been something that I've been working on with a good group of people for a couple of years now. And before I introduce those guys, I want to just give thanks to the Environmental Law Institute, the publisher, who they're out of Washington, D.C., and it's a nonprofit organization that's devoted to wetland preservation, basically. I mean, the environment they're all about the environment, but with a focus on wetlands. And they publish a lot of papers and books that are really quite technical, more geared for young professionals, law students, and people that are working toward making a career out of the environment. And this book is unusual for them. It's got a lot of informal stories that, in fact, most of it is about young kids engaging with Mud Lake. And it sort of just sneaks in a lot of science about wetlands and some philosophy on what I call circular energy. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. But and then of course climate change. So some important issues, and it's all kind of under the radar in the book. So until the end, it sort of comes home and really hits the whole climate change issue pretty directly. But for the most part, the beginning is kids enjoying the wetland and learning from that experience. So we got a little spam call coming in there. It happens all the time. Hope that doesn't disturb you here. So moving ahead here, some of the collaborators. First of all, I got to mention Susan Lovell. You might recognize that last name. That's my wife, who's a grandmother of 7, and with 3 kids. Well, she's a longtime Haslett girl, and grew up out in the farmlands. But her parents were best friends with the people that owned the O'Briens, the people that actually farmed the property next to Mud Lake. So she knew the area very well as a young kid, but wasn't really until we got together that she really was engaged with the lake. But she actually, the book was her idea. So pretty instrumental and kind of telling me when to stop. She called it when it was done, at least close to being done. I tried to keep it going make changes for a few more months, but in the end, she said, "Yep, that's it. We got to stop this and move on." So she's a great help in that regard. Um, Another instrumental person, Becky Goodman, who's the downtown director of Petoskey, formerly Lake Orion. Maybe you know both of those cities, but she actually is my sister. So she also engaged with Mud Lake in a different way than I did. I don't know if she ever really went there, but she helped wash the mud off and those kinds of things. Kept me out of trouble quite a bit. She kind of oversaw my activities. That's her in the lower right-hand corner. And myself, I think we're getting ready to head out to Sunday school. And then Beth Hagenboo um, grew up right on the edge of the swamp, the marsh, right next to Mud Lake. She's a landscape architect as well. I did not know her. She's a good 8 years or so younger than me. So when I was a kid, she was so young that, you just don't notice the 2-year-olds when you're 7 or 9. And, but I did deliver papers to her parents, so I kind of knew the family. But later, after she became a landscape architect, we did meet up, and she's done some great work. I've always admired what she's done with her husband. They have their own business, Ken Weichel. And this is a couple of images of Lafayette Gardens in downtown Detroit, which was a highly successful urban farming project. So, and she's done a lot of that kind of work. So hats off to Beth. Mark Nymphy, another old classmate that who grew up on Orlando Drive. Maybe some of you know that road. Is right there along kind of on the, I guess, east side of Mud Lake. He was a star in high school, both academically and athletically. We had a lot of good times together off and on, and he's shared some really great stories for the book as well. He's a former automobile worker, or actually an engineer for Ford Motor Company, director of their product line. So, I mean, pretty high up position. Owned a restaurant in Mackinac City after retiring from Ford, and now is relaxing out in Phoenix. Chris Early, another Haslett athletic champion, state champion wrestler, a great friend of mine as we grew up, living right there on Orlando Drive as well. He's one of the Orlando street gang, so he had some really interesting ideas and stories to tell about how he engaged with the marsh and the natural areas in the area. And Terry Sack, I guess I gotta keep saying another athlete. He actually went on to play football for Hillsdale College. But some of the big things that came out of his engagement with the marshlands is becoming a nurse in his 40s, and working in the medical industry prior to that. But his passion, just basically his passion for people, part-time fireman, umpire, and substitute teacher for some of the special needs children's in Florida. He's now retired in Florida. So basically doing things like organizing nationally touring musical acts like the Allman Brothers and that kind of thing. So he's still pretty busy. And then for our youngest member, Bridget Booth, who I did get to know while I was writing the book, and kind of reaching out for someone in the school system to give me some input. Bridget's very active with environment, trying to initiate this place-based education program within the school system. We're using the environment and the local area to help engage and inform the kids of their history and geography, and how it relates to, all the curriculum across the board. So she's been a great help in proofing the book, adding little ideas, and of course, sharing her vision for place-based education. So yeah, as we talked about, the book takes place right there in Haslett. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with Lake Lansing, and Mud Lake, of course, is this little pond south of the residential area in Haslett. The book starts out with it's in the prologue, a little bit of the geography and some history about Haslett, which is pretty interesting. I mean, I've been, as you know, I've been working a lot in Detroit, and there's so much history there. But when you start digging into what's going on, what happened in the Haslett area, there's so many similarities about what was happening here and in Southeast Michigan at the same time, certainly with the Native American history. Um, Lake Lansing was a hub for their community. The Chippewa lived here for thousands of years before the European settlers came, and then which started off with Obed Marshall in 1836, really not that long ago. Later, this guy James Haslett came into the picture with and starting up this Michigan spiritualist group, acquiring a lot of this property, beautiful property just south of Lake Lansing. So Obed, when he came into town, actually there was no town. He purchased this entire area, which we kind of now know as Haslett, for around $300. This was before Michigan was even a state, but it was still a U.S. territory. So there's a lot of that history in there. It kind of goes into the Lake Lansing Amusement Park, which, if you're familiar with Lake Lansing, that's just kind of on the west side of the lake here, kind of southwest corner. Quite the place, as we talked about last week, for youngsters our age, my age, when we were growing up. A lot of stories in there about that. And then, of course, as the history went on, after the 1940s and after the Second World War, the area was just flooded with the baby boomer generation, the young people coming from World War II. A lot of people settled here, and of course, new schools had to be built. Wilkshire, Raleigh was added on to, and then Hillbrook Park. So and then Murphy Elementary too. So it was a boom for kids. They were just running wild through the neighborhoods at that time. And then, of course, getting into the close-ups around Mud Lake, some of the geography there, certainly this expansive wetland was just like a magnet for the kids in the neighborhood. And I know even if you did not engage with a swamp somewhere, and if you had kids, you know that a 3-year-old cannot pass a puddle without walking through it. You know what I'm talking about. You've been there, and these kids, as I mentioned last week, we left the house in the morning without any supervision with this huge puddle to play in. And there was just nobody to tell you not to get in it. And so you were just there. It was the swamp, it was the woods. It was just a huge playground for a good number of kids to learn and experience the outdoors. So the first stories I mentioned last week are pretty personal, and I hope people can get through them. They're, I think it gets a little more exciting as the book goes on, but some of them are just like my dad taking me to Mud Lake to go fishing for the first time, which is pretty exciting when you're 9 years old. And then later going there with some of my younger friends against my parents' wishes. They didn't want me. They told me that's off limits. That you're not going to Mud Lake, but we did. That's just what kids do. They get out there and they experience it. So that's how it starts out. And then, of course, the culture, we start to weave in more of the kids, some of the, and how it, how we socialized. It was all about competition, who could jump the highest or the farthest and run the fastest and do daring stunts. And so trees sort of represented great ways to challenge each other, climbing them and jumping from limb to limb. And so there's stories about that. And how we played with guns and war games, shooting the Nazis and uh, playing Civil War. This was back during the Civil War centennial. So we dressed up as Yankees and rebels and had little war games in our backyards. But that's how kids played in those days. And of course, the girls, they had a different idea. Beth Hagenboo shares her stories, which were very much more cerebral experiences in the wetlands. Just kind of looking at small things, leaves and plants, and poking around at tadpoles, and um, learning from the wetlands in a kind of a different way than what some of the boys did. But that's the difference between boys and girls in that age. There's a good amount of information about the history that was happening of the 60s, that was happening at the same time. The kids are just focused on the swamps and the wetlands, but at that same time, John Glenn was going around the earth, and we had Marilyn Monroe, uh, who was found dead. The Kennedys were assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Malcolm X, of course, was a Lansing native, so he was very near Mud Lake. And of course, he was assassinated as well. The whole Vietnam War thing, that's talked about in detail. And there's some analogies made about the Vietnam War with the idea that so many of Americans died in that war, which was not started by us, but in a similar fashion, there are people dying due to climate change, which is a war on basically a war on nature that was not started by us either. So there's some analogies that are made there, kind of some deep thinking going on. A little bit about the history of the environmental movement with Rachel Carson's books, and then some of the things happening in our state with the Rouge River catching on fire, which that and the Cuyahoga River catching on fire kind of stimulated some of the movements for Clean Water Act, and of course the whole EPA was started because of some of that. So there's some history lessons here to learn as well that are hopefully told in a very easy to understand way. Then getting right back into some stories about kids in the area, with some again letting people know about wetlands and their importance of them without hitting them in the face with it. Those things are outlined, but are really dominated by other stories of kids playing at the water tower and actually climbing the water tower, which is actually ridiculous. But some of that stuff happened, and that's just what the kids did in those days. So that's talked about. And the relationship at the same time, we're talking about wetlands, purifying the water for the aquifers. And at the same time, we're talking about kids climbing a water tower that's being, servicing the community from the water, from using the water from the wetlands pumping. So there's all these little relationships that might go unnoticed, but if you read it 10 times or 15 times, or 30 times, like I've had to do, it's amazing how many little strings are attached to different thoughts and ideas. This whole idea of circular energy, I got kind of carried away with it, I think, maybe, but it's, to me, it's always been interesting how there's so many movements that go in circles without without any waste or noticeable consumption of energy, like the planets and like the water cycle. And then relating to the fact that, there's a previous story about John Glenn, but the whole idea of him orbiting the Earth, just moving out there in space. Another previous story that's talked about it before this point in the book are kids jumping around a box elder tree and the strength that they get from that. There's so much energy from these circular movements that don't emit waste, and how that relates then to the whole idea of recycling and sustainability. And what is sustainability? And so you start to understand that sustainability is actions that don't emit waste, is basically what we're talking about with that. So it's sort of an in-depth idea of how to describe recycling and state of sustainability related to some bigger picture ideas. Moving into another story about a dog named Duke that was actually my dog, but he was a neighborhood dog as well. He did a lot of circular movements around the town every day in a regular way, from taking kids back and forth to school to visiting the neighbors for breakfast, and then riding in a car, and showing how he can fly his ears and be cool to his friends. Well, that whole story with him riding in a car transitions then into the idea of this other circle between of carbon, the carbon cycle and the carbon budget, where carbon is traded between plants and animals. And I know everybody knows about this, but the book is intended for younger people. And this whole idea of the carbon cycle is hopefully described in a way that kids can understand it pretty easily, using diagrams, simple diagrams like this as well. But the whole big point of it is, as carbon is also packed away with dead plants and animals underground, after millions of years, creates this fossil fuel. And now that we're bringing that out of the ground in huge quantities, and reducing the plants on Earth, Michigan was once 100% forested, and now it's, I don't know what the percentage is, but obviously it's almost all gone. And that's the case in a lot of places, when you think about the prairies of the Midwest as well. Those have been long gone. Those deep-rooted plants, all those carbon sinks we've depleted, at the same time are pumping out CO2 into the atmosphere. That's the reason we've got a problem. So those things are described, and hopefully in a simplistic way, without hitting you in the face again. It's not an aggressive way of describing it. It's just again, sort of a soft way. And then it gets into another deep chapter with, social injustice and how that relates to, well, there's a couple stories in there about the neighborhood, some a group of Asians that try to go fishing on Mud Lake and weren't very welcome. And then there's a story about an African-American family that came house shopping in the neighborhood, and there was some disparaging remarks by some of the locals, and a big conversation that is described in the book. So that's talked about, and it gets into the whole idea of spiritualism in a way that equates it more to nature, nature being part of this guiding principle. And some of the messages really from Martin Luther King are mentioned here, and how it relates some of his ideas to service to the community and bottom line truth, the whole idea of not following conspiracy theories, but really how truth is what's guiding us, and that can all be found in the natural world. So some interesting deep ideas about nature in this chapter. And that's followed up with, it starts to lighten up a little bit, but how mud lakes relationships to other water bodies. This chapter I think is Mud Lake's family circle. I can't see the whole image because I've got some other stuff going. Oh, there it is, Mud Lake's family circle, correct. So we first talk about the Detroit River and how that, a little bit of that history, how that economy evolved around the Great Lakes, how the shipping and eventually the automobile industry, but it all evolved around water. And similarly, the same thing happened here in Meridian with our economy revolving around Lake Lansing, going back to the Native Americans. But then there's another family partner, and that's the world's water that's talked about in kind of a fun story, which I'm not going to reveal to you. You gotta kind of get into it, but it makes a big deal out of Lake Lansing and Haslett kind of being a pinnacle, a starting point for water. But it's again, it's sort of a circular idea. You have to read it. There'd be no way to explain it in the 2 minutes or 3 minutes that I have here to talk about it. And then we get into some technical talk about swamps, marshes, the difference between marshes and bogs. And I think when I was writing this chapter a couple of years ago, I was talking to Peter Carrington about this as well, to get a little help about what is Mud Lake? Is the area around it, is it a marsh or a bog? And it has some plants that are like some of the carnivorous plants that are more representative in a bog, but because it's being fed by a stream and has an inlet and an outlet, that pretty much says it should be a marsh. It might even be a combination. I mean, the north end of it is pretty boggy, and the south end is pretty marshy. So maybe it's kind of a combination of both. So the best I can say about it is it's really swampy. Mud Lake is really swampy. So that's talked about in sort of a humorous way in the book. It gets into some of the ideas of glacial movements, which are also quite secular. They come and they go. And what in my research I kind of found out, maybe a lot of you already know this, but we are in an ice age right now. It's just that it's a non-glaciated period. And this first graph sort of represents, here we are today with relatively warm temperatures. Well, 10,000 years ago, which people call the last ice age. Well, really, this has been going up and down for really about 3 million years. If you look down in this other graph, our ice age is 3 million years old, and we've had a number of warm and cold spells within this ice age prior to an extremely hot period, this whole Jurassic period, way before people were on Earth. But this is when the whole dinosaur period, which was long gone before our ice age. So some of that kind of comes out in the book, which is I think interesting science or history, however you want to describe it. But it also helps us to understand the climate change that we're in right now, which is nothing to do with some of the other things that are talked about in the book, like the wobble and the tilt of the Earth, which are also impact our our warm spells. They help to make these little changes within our ice age, but which are natural. But if we look at the trends of the wobble and the tilt of the Earth, we should be headed into another cold spell, another glaciated period. But in fact, we're going the opposite direction. We're getting warmer. So that kind of gives us proof that it's the carbon over the last couple hundred years that is causing the problem. So that's sort of described, hopefully, in a very easy to understand manner. And then just to wrap it up, it gets back into some, kind of leaves the whole scientific aspect and goes back to the kids, talks a lot about the Orlando Street Gang and some of their fun times, near-death experiences in the marsh, and playing in the pines, which is another fun place here over by the railroad tracks, which is now a condominium development. And of course, the woods is an expansion of the Lakeview Heights subdivision now. So a lot of this area is gone, but certainly the expansive marsh around Mud Lake is still there, and certainly worthy of protection, which is a little bit talked about in this last chapter, going full circle, along with some of the other champions that have that lived in the swamp area of Mud Lake. Some, Oz Warback, who actually the Warback family is another group, another family on my paper route, and I didn't even know it at the time, but he was this tremendous artist for the DNR that did these little cartoons about nature at a time when, these things weren't even talked about. So he's a pretty special guy that grew up right on or not grew up, but lived on the edge of the marsh. And then a number of other people are mentioned in the book as well. It is pretty incredible how subliminally living near Mud Lake has impacted some pretty influential people. This is where Bridget's vision for Mud Lake is talked about, and then it gets into quite a lot of detail about climate change itself. This whole Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, our currents in the ocean, and how the ocean is another carbon sink. The land certainly is a carbon sink, but the ocean is a tremendous carbon sink. But what's happening with the idea that it is starting to store more and more carbon, and if in fact is starting to impact this current that's really important to our climate, moving the warm air, the warm water, and the warm air away from the equator, trying to equalize the temperatures over the globe. So those are some important concepts that are talked about, and then finally some ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Obviously, you guys all know about with green infrastructure and so forth. And then in the epilogue, that's emphasized. We talk a little bit about some of the recent climate disasters, and when you think back on these, they happen. They're starting to happen more frequently, as we all know. But over the last few years, it's hard to remember how many have happened. You just they're in the news and then they're gone. They're in the news and they're gone. But when you start listing them, it's pretty incredible what's been happening over the last couple of years. Even with all this bad stuff happening, though, it's talked about, a little bit of hope for the future with the fact that some good things are going on with biodiversity. Certainly, a lot of the animals that are that we thought were going extinct, and some of our water bodies that we thought were going to be in terrible condition we are reversing. So humans are doing some great things. If we could just get our arms around it and get serious about it. There's so much resistance. People say, well, that's the weather. We can't do anything about the weather. Well, in fact, we can do just about anything we want. And there's so many, there's examples talked about in the book, how we've done some great things and we can take care of this problem. And that's where we get into these climate action plans and talking about the importance of those and getting familiar with those. And Meridian's action plan is mentioned, and then the whole idea of the circular economy, which gets back to the whole point of circular energy and the main focus of the book. So there's it in a nutshell. And if you've got questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Thank you so much, Sam. Comments, observations, thoughts?
Hey, Sam, that was very interesting. Boy, your book is covering a lot of territory. I think makes it for at least for somebody like me, it makes it very interesting how things get connected and integrated. You look forward to reading it. Do you know? Is Mud Lake area still a magnet kind of an area where kids roam around? I know there's things have changed with respect to kids' activities. Everybody's on there playing video games, and maybe you don't have a sense for that, whether those sorts of kids' activities are still happening.
Did you, it wasn't quite clear. Are you asking, is Mud Lake still a magnet?
Yeah, our kids from the neighborhood still kind of roaming around Mud Lake? Maybe you have no way of knowing.
Well, I do know that some do. And there is the book does conclude with a story about that, of a current group of kids engaging with the lake. So they do. I don't know that it's as prolific as it was when I was a kid. And that's partly due to the cultural change, like you said, with kids on their phones and socializing in different ways. But it's also, I'm going to just speculate because I've got grandchildren, and knowing how their schedules are, they're not turned loose like we were. They're very well organized. They, after school activities are, if they're not in sports, they're doing something else. And it's pretty structured. So, and even all summer long, they're in sport camps or band camps or something that will keep them pretty occupied. So the free time, I think, is less than what is today. And that's why programs like what Bridget is doing, where these are structured, but they get people to engage, even though it's in a structured way, with these wild areas, natural areas, are so important because they're not they don't have the free time to do it so much on their own. So that's where these natural programs are really important.
Remind us too, what first got you thinking about doing the book, and how long ago was that when you first kind of thought maybe I should do a book?
Well, again, it kind of goes back to conversations between my wife and I. Both, had enjoying our time in Haslett. I mean, when we were K through 12 in Haslett, and so many, even before we knew each other in a dating way, the shared experiences we had as kids, we talked about a lot. And the notion, I mean, we always just kind of went back to Mud Lake being the primary place for the wildest experiences. You know what I mean? The most natural. Like you're completely away from everything when you are out in the swamp by Mud Lake.
Okay, hi, I'm Linda Carrington. I'm Peter's wife. I wondered how old you were when Bob Copeland was at the middle school and he brought the log cabin in and he took his outdoor education class out to Mud Lake kind of regularly. They had boats out there and everything. And how familiar are you with that?
Yeah, I was young when I was playing at Mud Lake. The cabin was not there. The cabin is talked about in the book, and Bob Copeland is mentioned as the inspiration for that cabin, along with Jane Taylor.
Yeah.
There, that came more in Beth Hagenbooth's time. And Beth actually helped construct the cabin. So that's mentioned a little bit, putting the shingles on the roof and that kind of thing. For me, Bob Copeland was he was my gym teacher in junior high and taught me how to square dance. So I knew Bob Copeland very well. He was great.
Yeah.
But it was before the log cabin thing.
Oh, I just wondered. Bob and Sue Copeland were my ex-in-laws. I was married to
Oh,
Bob's older son in the 70s.
uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and I just remember all the stories and being there at around Christmas time and just little stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I mean I didn't know Bob personally. I mean he was a teacher, but and as a youngster you're on a different level. But I think I did, unfortunately, Sue and I, my wife and I and kids, um, we moved to Kalamazoo when my first daughter was in second grade. And
Okay.
so I don't know the whole Copeland family, unfortunately,
Hmm.
the kids.
Well, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Your book sounds really interesting. I'm glad you did it.
Well, thank you.
This is Roberta. I have a question. For those of us who are not familiar, could you describe geographically exactly where Mud Lake is located?
Well, if you're familiar with the high school, does that ring a bell? Haslett High School? It's right.
Near the library, behind the shopping center where Ace Hardware is located.
The high school? Here,
Okay.
I'll give you a good, I'm gonna share the screen again and I'll pop up,
Give me some street names.
let's do this. This will be the easiest thing.
She's gonna need street names.
Yeah, you're gonna need
Yeah,
to give me some
I can do
description.
that. I can
I
do that,
appreciate
but
that.
I'm gonna share.
I can help you with that if you want. Here, if you
Can
don't
I-
mind, I've got
can-
my
got-
parcel viewer open.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I don't mind. I should contribute somewhat to this conversation, right? Okay, I've got share screen. Oh, Leroy, you've disabled my
yeah,
screen sharing.
We're all
Sorry,
disabled.
Roberta is visually challenged, so street
Oh, I'm
names would be
sorry.
preferred. But I will enable it
Yeah,
as
but
we
other
speak.
people might want to see it too.
I'm
That's fine.
sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Good point, Roberta. Other people might want to
Roberta?
see it.
Haslett High School is on Marsh Road, south of Haslett.
Okay.
Um,
In between Haslett and Ty Hart, straight east of Haslett High School.
Yeah, you've got where the hardware and stuff is that you referenced, and then there's a railroad track that runs diagonally, and then you keep going south on Marsh. The high school's on the east side of Marsh Road.
Yep, okay,
And the lake is on property. I've got it shared now. You can see it's owned by Haslett Public Schools. So,
okay.
I'm not going to develop anytime soon or anything like that.
So it's kind of tucked in behind the high school.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
Exactly.
Great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
It's
What-
behind the high school, and to the north is the neighborhood called Lakeview Heights.
hmm
So that's the Lakeview Heights and the high school, and then Cornell Road. And I think Tyhart was mentioned. Tyhart is to the south. They surround Mud Lake. And from none of those roads can you see Mud Lake. You cannot see it. It's
Okay.
just back in there in the middle of the marsh.
What's the history of the public schools owning that property? Like, when did they gain ownership of that?
Ooh.
It
Is
was
that different ownership than who owned it back when you were living there?
when I was a kid, it was owned by the Church family. The Churches lived on Marsh Road, and the O'Briens farmed it. They lived on the property. I don't know if it was a rental situation or what, but the whole O'Brien family farmed the ground where the high school sits right now, the high ground. It was 1970, I think it was 1972 was the first year was when the school opened. Because I graduated in 70, my wife was in 71. She was the last class at the old high school, and the next year there was the new class, 1972, that they graduated from the new high school. I don't know how the property transact. I mean, how that all happened, the transition between the Church family and the high school, but that's the time period.
Have you started working on the sequel yet, Sam?
I don't have another idea. There's I'm still, in my own mind, thinking of all the changes. Maybe there'll be a new version or something that just sort of an update that could be made. But
Well, Linda and Peter, I'm sure, have some stories that can be added to the sequel.
yeah, I bet. And there's the more people I talk to about it, there's so many other people that could have been included that lived even on Biscayne, both when I lived there and for the decades later. There's so many people that have experiences with this area that could be shared. So this is like just a smidgen of the reality of what happened at Mud Lake.
There you go.
One of the things you might consider too is finding the Anishinaabe or Native American people in the area, because they might have more history from a long time ago. Just a suggestion.
I like that. I really do. And if that's what I was getting at, if I was to update this, that would be definitely something I would want to look into. I did a little bit of research on that in the beginning, but there was just so many other things to look at, unfortunately. And that topic was really hard hard to find information on for whatever reason.
Understandable. Nokomis Center, I don't know what state of what it's in, what's going on there right now, but that might be a source for you to start with. I know there was a family, the Fox family. I can't remember the name of the other ones, but I know that they were in the schools, you know, so that's how I knew them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hey, Sam, you know, I mean, you were very familiar with Mud Lake in this area, but as you were researching the book, did you have any big surprises, things that just you didn't expect?
I think the biggest learning thing for me was what I started to mention is the whole ice age thing. You know, the fact that our ice age is 3 million years old, and you know, people say the last ice age was 10,000 years ago. Well, that was just the last cold period of our ice age, which is sort of interesting to me. I think that was probably the biggest surprise to me.
One of the things that I don't know how to articulate this, but just that learning that occurs in nature, I think Bridget's vision of kind of a future environmental education programs is intriguing to me. But one of the things that seems not very natural is how much we keep kids locked up in school all day. And that's probably not exactly accurate, but kids seem to not have a lot of time, just free time. And left to their own devices, I think they would be a richer childhood in many ways. With between sports and school and homework, it's just unnatural to me.
It's interesting that you use the phrase left to their own devices, because I think most kids these days would be actually on their devices if given the time.
Yeah.
Good one.
And I think that's a good point, Leroy. But you know what I think, again, this is pure speculation, but back in the 60s, there was people, you know, the kids were a little freer to do what they wanted, and there was some trouble. You know what I mean? The kids once in a while would get in trouble, and there was, I think, a movement since the 60s with trying to be safer. You know, the whole thing with seatbelts. Cigarettes are really kind of taboo. We do things. There's so much emphasis on safety and keeping our kids safe. So creating a structured environment for them to not get into trouble, I guess. I mean, kind of simply put, but is part of that transition to be safe, and it's sort of good, but you just kind of you also miss out on some of the benefits gained by being a little freer.
A fear of natural cycles like birth and death.
Yeah, a little bit.
As a parent of younger kids, I agree, Sam. It's I think there's that perspective of understanding that if kids were allowed to be as free as back when you were a kid, I don't think people would care for what would be happening. And so I have a 13 and 16-year-old, and so it's very different than decades ago. And so I think we have to have an understanding that if we were to leave kids to how you had it back decades ago, I don't think a lot of people would care for what the things would happen. So we've had to move to much more structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At the same time, working with kids right now with a sustainable fashion show, kids have a lot of diverse interests that are beyond math and science and history, social studies and phys ed, and encouraged to pursue their interests and given a little bit of free time to pursue their interests seems to me to be a fruitful opportunity.
I was just in a meeting this week with the school district, and I was glad to hear them say they're trying to move toward away from this only college bound perspective, so that people who are more interested in other things that can be just as worthwhile and just as an important perspective. Not everybody is college bound, and that's fine and good, and not everybody is tech bound, and not everybody is whatever bound. I think that's what you're kind of getting at too, is just the idea that people should be able to explore the directions of which they find their passion and what they like to be involved in, and have that just be as successful and just as important. And so I think, but it's how do you figure that out in society and in the structures that are there in school. And so I think it's just a way of having to learn how to process through that and make it be a norm and not the odd thing that one person's trying. So I think it's just there's a learning curve to have how to move away from directions that haven't always been a certain way, or it's that I always talk about pendulum. I think you pendulum too far this way and you got to get pendulum back, and then you just keep going back to try to find a better balance of things.
That's encouraging. Thank you, Sarah. I can't help but think of the term bound rather than binding them to a particular or having someone select a particular path, unleashing them. I think I like that metaphor.
Yes, I am so grateful for the amount of freedom I had when I was that age, even though it did end up one day with me bringing my little red wagon home with a human skeleton in it. A moment that I'm sure my parents were less than enthusiastic about.
How could you have never told us that story before? Oh my God.
Well, I was an insect collector as a kid. Totally. One day, collecting insects, I stood on a little tiny sassafras tree stump on the brink of a bank of sand where sand had been industrially removed, and a big clot of dirt fell out from under the stump, and there was this round thing protruding from it. And when I jumped down there and picked it up, it was a human skull.
Where was this?
This was
It must have been down south. You said sassafras.
well, sassafras is very common here.
Oh, okay.
But it was down in St. Joseph area.
Oh, okay.
And I went home and got my red wagon because I had this fantasy I'd wire this thing up for my closet. But when I showed it to my dad, he says, son, we have to call somebody about this. And we did.
Wow.
Did they ever figure out who it was?
I've never heard a thing about the identity of the person. There were apparently other family members there, one of whose skull was found the next day, I think, by another kid wandering around.
Wow.
The funeral home director, who the sheriff dropped off the pewter coffin handles to review, came to the house Sunday morning and said that he had found the pewter coffin handles in an ancient catalog, and that it was from the late early 1700s, which of course would have been into the period of the French. The French settled that part of Michigan. Fort Miami was St. Joseph, ultimately.
But Cameron said that that was not.
But it has been pointed out to me by my brother that the remains of the casket have signs of possibly being a little more of a manufactured product than would have been available that long ago. It was apparently a glass-lined coffin, and the glass was all through the soil, along with bits of black cloth and the shredded remains of the wood that the coffin had represented.
Well, that sounds like another dialogue. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Sam. Any parting comments as we wrap things up for the day? Try and keep these to an hour. And again,
So I
oh,
reserved it,
go
I
ahead.
reserved it, Sam, so then they'll just email for when it's time to purchase, I guess?
Yeah, what I've understood from Environmental Law Institute is when the book comes out, and Rachel from ELI let me know, it should be by March 15th. That's what she said.
Thank you so much.
That's always subject to change, but that's the last word I have, March 15th. Anybody that has reserved it, they'll be get an email saying that it's available. You know, that it's in print or released for purchase, I guess. That's the idea.
Some
Thank you.
any other parting comments?
Just thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to be here today. Thank you.
Yeah,
Hope to
really,
see.
I look forward to seeing it.
Okay. Just look over any blunders, you know what I'm saying? There's still changes that need to be made, but we'll get those next time around.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'll see some of you next week, and feel free to join us anytime. Suggest future speakers. Got some ideas today from Sam about future speaker possibilities, but feel free to invite folks. We have a couple of interesting speakers. Mike Booz is going to join us next month, as will Ryan Shaner, talk about GIS and environmental data. So stay tuned. Have a great week, folks.